Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. I'm incredibly excited to guide you through part 1 of a truly fascinating masterclass derived from the Aryuri manuscript. Today, we're diving into the preface through chapter 4, and we're exploring a concept that touches literally every single aspect of our lives, the invisible systems shaping how we organize, understand, and compress the reality around us. We're going to look at exactly how human beings use maps, categories, merit, and discreditation to make sense of a wildly complex world.
Now, I want to hook you immediately with this profound question straight from the preface of the text. Think about it for a second. What actually happens when we forget that our maps are just maps? What happens when societies slowly mistake their interpretations for reality itself? The truth is, you and I inherited maps before we even realized we were using them. We inherited cultural assumptions, institutional labels, social scripts, the whole shebang. So our goal today is to learn how to see these systems clearly so we can finally understand our own perception. All right, let's jump right into section 1, the maps we inherit, the blueprint of human survival. So to even survive, we absolutely must compress an overwhelmingly complex universe into usable, bite-sized patterns. How does the manuscript define a map? Well, it's not just a piece of paper with roads on it. A map is a compression of reality. Think about a child touching a hot stove. Instantly, their nervous system builds a map. Glowing metal equals pain. Or think about a driver navigating traffic patterns. We have to filter out most of reality's infinite details so that the tiny slice of reality right in front of us becomes usable. We literally have to do this, right? Otherwise, we'd completely drown in the complexity of it all. But here is where things get tricky. A map is a vital tool. Absolutely crucial, but it becomes incredibly dangerous when that tool becomes a throne. When we demand that reality justify itself to our simplifications, we fall right into a trap. We start treating our labels, our categories, and our assumptions as if they contain the absolute, total truth of a situation.
Let's look at how this plays out in real life through what the text calls a cruel feedback loop. It goes like this. Step 1, a child gets labeled difficult. Suddenly, the adults in the room begin expecting disruption, and because of that expectation, any moments of tenderness or curiosity from that child, they become completely invisible. The map just isn't looking for them. Finally, the child gets frustrated at being misunderstood, which just confirms the initial label to the adults. The map literally constructed the terrain it claimed to merely observe.
Moving on to chapter 2, when categories become cages, the sorting machine. Now, we obviously cannot think without categories, but we have to be incredibly careful about how they organize our attention. Every single category performs 4 invisible functions. It directs our attention, it distributes permission, it creates an inside and an outside, so exclusion, and it automatically loads inference. Take a neighborhood that society labels as dangerous. That category directs outsiders to notice decay way faster than they notice mutual care. It distributes permission for increased surveillance. It excludes the area from financial investment, and it loads the inference that the people living there are unreliable. That category is actively training our perception.
So how do we actually fix this? The text outlines a really sharp contrast between a disciplined category and an undisciplined one. A disciplined category remembers it is just a tool. It stays open to correction when reality answers back. An undisciplined category, on the other hand, flattens reality. It demands absolute obedience and ignores any contradiction. If a student labeled average shows brilliant insight, an undisciplined category ignores the brilliance just to protect the label.
Which brings us to chapter 3, the illusion of merit, the trust shortcut. How do societies operationalize these categories to compress trust? Because we literally cannot personally verify every single thing in our fast-paced lives, we use merit. When you drive over a bridge, you don't pull over to recalculate the engineer's math. When you board an airplane, you don't test the pilot's knowledge of physics, do you? Of course not. Merit is the social shortcut we use. It says, hey, this person or institution has demonstrated enough reliability that we can safely grant them our trust. But here is where systems start going off the rails a bit. A healthy merit system measures demonstrated function, so actual competence, skill, and reliability. But over time, simply because it's faster, systems start rewarding legitimacy performance. They look for proxy signals, maybe a prestigious accent, polished institutional language, or just extreme confidence. The system stops rewarding actual ability and starts rewarding people who fluently perform the signals of legitimacy.
The fallout from this drift? It's huge. As the manuscript perfectly puts it, false confidence is more dangerous than uncertainty. When merit stops tracking actual function, structural inequality disguises itself as a natural moral hierarchy. We start accelerating trust toward people who simply look the part, while withholding trust from people who have deep functional understanding, but maybe lack the recognized symbols of institutional polish. Let's pivot to chapter 4, the weapon of discreditation, the erasure system. If merit is how society grants trust, discreditation is how society builds systems to withdraw it. And it all relies on this really sticky concept called reality weight. This is the amount of seriousness your perception receives before any real evaluation happens. Someone with high reality weight gets interpreted generously. Their mistakes are seen as exceptions. But someone with low reality weight, their words are pre-weakened. Their emotions become suspect before they even finish their sentence. Look, we absolutely need discreditation to protect ourselves from actual unreliability, from things truly detached from reality. But the real danger is confusing unreliability with inconvenience. A person pointing out a structural harm in a workplace might be labeled unprofessional or difficult. They aren't detached from reality, right? They are just detached from the group's existing map. The label gets weaponized to protect a broken system from a really inconvenient truth.
So I want to ask you directly, whose reality weight is your system lowering? Think about your own workplace, your own family, or the institutions you interact with. Are the people being dismissed genuinely unstable, or are they simply exposing a structural harm that the system would rather just ignore?
And that leads us to section 5, disciplining our reality, a call for humility.
As we pull these first 4 chapters together, we arrive at a powerful call for humility. We have to actively discipline our interpretations. We must hold categories without turning them into cages. We have to use standards without mistaking them for moral destiny. And above all, we have to allow reality to correct our frameworks. Yes, we have to compress reality to survive, but we've got to remain humble enough to revise our maps when they no longer accurately describe the terrain.
Because at the end of the day, the map is not the person. Human beings will always exceed the labels, the diagnostics, the metrics, and the categories that institutions try to contain them in. Our awareness of this is exactly what keeps us humane.
I'm going to leave you with this really provocative final thought from the source material. What happens when you stop running on autopilot? When you recognize the invisible architecture of perception all around you? You become an active participant in reality. Keep questioning your maps and stay fascinated by your own perception. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep learning.
Welcome back. Okay, today's explainer is a truly fascinating deep dive into a text that maps the invisible social architecture surrounding all of us. We're going to explore a really profound, deeply human question. How do the systems we rely on every single day, our institutions, schools, hospitals, workplaces, actually force us to compress our true selves just to survive them?
Think about it for a second. Have you ever been sitting in a doctor's office in agonizing pain, but you forced yourself to sound completely calm and collected just to make sure you were taken seriously? Or maybe you've been in a job interview and you kind of completely flattened your actual personality into this perfectly polished professional performance. Why is it that proving you need help or proving you're competent often feels way more exhausting than the problem itself? Well, the source material we're looking at today offers a brilliant answer to exactly this.
All right, let's get into section 1, the gate, surviving the threshold. We're going to approach the very first thing we bump into in any system. So, to function at a massive scale, large institutions literally cannot process infinite human complexity. Think about it. A hospital can't intimately know the complete life story of every single patient the moment they walk in the door. A university can't custom rebuild its entire educational model for every single student's unique brain. So what do? They build thresholds. These are the gates that convert actual human beings into administrative operational signals. You stop being you, and you become a school transcript, a diagnostic code, a credit score, or a performance review. And this illustrates the absolute core tension here. The threshold does not process the whole human being. It only processes what the system can efficiently operationalize. Now, if your reality translates poorly into those neat little formats, like maybe your suffering doesn't fit a standard diagnostic code or your intelligence isn't caught by a standardized test, your reality doesn't just disappear. Obviously, you're still experiencing it, but operationally, inside the machinery of the system, it acts as though it has disappeared. Because we all inherently know our survival depends on passing these gates, we adapt. The text uses a really powerful term for this: truth shrinking to pass. This happens when reality literally compresses itself into an institutionally processable form just to survive recognition. It's like shoving a giant, complex puzzle into a tiny, square box. A traumatized person might edit their memory into a perfectly neat chronological sequence because they know a fragmented truth lowers their credibility. A worker hides their total exhaustion behind a fake smile because visible burnout threatens their employability.
Which brings us to section 2, the translation, the violence of readability. Let's see how this builds into the constant, exhausting performance we have to keep up to remain readable.
So let's talk about legibility. Legibility is the process through which human complexity becomes readable enough for systems to process. But here is the major danger. What becomes easiest for a bureaucracy to read suddenly starts competing with what is actually true. For example, a calm, incredibly articulate patient might be seen as way more credible than a terrified patient who is totally overwhelmed by their pain, simply because calmness is more legible to the medical system. And this creates a profound, almost tragic split between the lived self and the readable self. We literally fracture our attention. We have to divide our energy between actually experiencing our lives and continuously translating ourselves to make sure our existence remains admissible to the systems around us. We constantly monitor our tone, our posture, our emotional calibration. We quickly learn exactly which forms of grief receive patience and which forms of anger get punished. We continuously groom the readable self, completely at the expense of the lived self. Over time, this adaptation becomes so ingrained that we actually lose track of where the performance ends and our spontaneous experience begins. The text captures this beautifully and painfully with a single thought. A person laughs automatically while exhausted. They apologize before even speaking. They minimize their pain automatically. The readable self gradually separates entirely from the lived self, masking our human reality just to keep up the performance the system wants to see.
So the takeaway here is that systems frequently confuse institutional readability with actual legitimacy. A polished speaker appears more trustworthy before they've presented a single shred of evidence. Professional fluency is mistaken for actual intelligence. Basically, formatting begins overpowering substance. It creates a sort of quiet, procedural violence where people are forced to continuously edit the reality just to get recognized.
Moving right along to section 3, the cost. Starving for recognition. What happens when we look at the deep psychological toll of this non-stop self-translation?
We can actually measure this toll by looking at something called reality weight. This is the amount of seriousness, patience, and credibility granted to a person's perceptions before any judgment occurs. And as we all know, reality weight is definitely not distributed evenly. Some people walk into a room and their ambiguity is interpreted so generously, their mistakes are seen as mere exceptions, while others walk in carrying low reality weight, meaning their emotions are instantly suspect and their accuracy is written off as a total fluke.
When people are denied this recognition for long enough, they experience recognition starvation. When your reality repeatedly fails to gain social confirmation, your nervous system literally steps in to conserve expression. You just stop explaining your pain, you stop asking for help, you preemptively shrink yourself to avoid the pain of being made socially unreal. You just make yourself smaller, simply to survive.
I want to pause and just let this quote sink in for a moment. The most institutionally successful self may become the least emotionally inhabited self. It is a devastating paradox, right? Our systems so often reward the exact people who are best at concealing the psychological costs imposed by the systems themselves. The worker who perfectly hides their complete burnout appears the most resilient, so they get the promotion, while internally they're slowly disappearing.
All right, section 4, the world, building operational reality. Let's zoom out from the individual to see the massive societal world that this collective process builds over time.
When these institutional gates and rules for legibility are repeated across millions and millions of lives, they create operational reality. This happens when collective interpretations gain so much social and institutional reinforcement that they actually begin shaping material consequences regardless of whether the underlying interpretation was ever accurate to begin with. It's when sheer repetition starts masquerading as inevitability.
And this creates a wild, self-reinforcing feedback loop. Watch how this works. Step 1, a system sets an operational threshold. Step 2, people shrink themselves to pass it. Step 3, the system rewards those who successfully adapt. And step 4, over time, the people who succeed appear naturally superior, and those who fail appear naturally deficient. The system completely forgets its own architecture and imagines that these outcomes just emerge directly from nature. The map literally constructs the terrain it claims to merely observe.
Now, we have to be absolutely clear here. Impartially speaking, just because an operational reality is socially constructed, that absolutely does not mean its material consequences aren't devastatingly real. Things like professional legitimacy, credit scores, or even money, they are socially constructed concepts, but lacking them, that can literally destroy a life. The real danger is when we start treating these constructed categories as eternal natural truths, which completely blinds us to the material harm they might be causing people.
Finally, section 5, the solution. Institutional corrigibility. How do we navigate this invisible architecture without completely losing our humanity to the machinery? The explainer points to disciplining our maps. What does that look like? It means actively resisting the urge to reduce complex people to simple labels. We need institutions that actually keep their thresholds open to correction when reality proves them wrong. We have to value actual contact with human reality way more than we value administrative comfort. And above all, we need disciplined humility, as individuals and as institutions, to step back and say, hey, our system might not be tracking reality accurately anymore, and we need to fix it.
We really have to drive home this core realization. The map is not the person. A diagnosis is not the patient. A standardized test score is not the totality of a student's mind. A performance review is definitely not the whole worker. These are just compressed interpretations. Sure, they're tools.
Welcome back to part 3 of our Masterclass Explainer. Today, we're setting a slightly different, maybe more cinematic tone. Think of it as dark mode for your mind, because as we dive deep into chapters 9 through 12, we are preparing to finally wake up to the source code of our reality. Now, up until now, we've looked at how we interpret the world, but today we're looking at how the world has interpreted us and how we can actually start rewriting that script.
Okay, let's dive into this with a thought experiment the source text calls the meteor test. Imagine a massive meteor is hurtling toward Earth right this exact second. Can your credit score stop it? No, of course not. What about your prestige at work? Your fancy job title? No, absolutely not. That rock literally does not care about the Dow Jones. And yet, while these abstract concepts aren't physical matter, they completely and totally govern our daily lives. They dictate where you live, what you eat, who you interact with. These abstractions build the actual walls of our reality.
So how exactly do we navigate these unseen walls? Well, here's our literal blueprint for today's deep dive. First, we'll cover architecture becomes identity. Second, defending the broken map. Third, the 4DP reconstruction framework. And finally, linear reality deduction.
Let's start with section 1. Architecture becomes identity. This is all about how external voices build our inner walls.
And this brilliantly illustrates a core truth. No human being forms a self entirely alone. We grow up inside environments that are already organized by legitimacy systems, emotional expectations, institutional pressures, the whole shebang. Most of the time, we're living as completely passive residents inside our own minds. We're just clicking the bright, shiny icons on our mental desktops, totally blinded to the matrix-like source code that's actually generating our reality. We think we're making free choices, when in fact we're executing programs installed by our environments long before we ever had the admin password to our own brains.
Let's look at how this coding happens in real time. Say a child reacts to underlying family dysfunction by acting out. The family, mostly just trying to preserve its own stability, slaps a label on them, the difficult child. Now that is external architecture, but eventually that external voice doesn't even need to be repeated anymore because the structure reproduces itself internally. The massive, complex reality of that family context just gets flattened into this tiny, portable self-judgment. The external label literally transforms into a carryable shame, and the child starts believing, I am inherently difficult.
Which leads us to this absolutely profound insight from the text. Compression becomes internal architecture. I really want you to let that sink in. People fail publicly once, right? And they compress their entire self into failure. They get called too loud or too needy, and they build a permanent, carryable identity out of that repeated simplification. They literally begin living inside a simplified summary that's honestly no more accurate than a billboard slogan.
So, if these internal maps are so incredibly restrictive, why on earth don't we just drop them? Well, that brings us to Section 2, Defending the Broken Map, and why we fiercely protect our painful illusions.
The answer to this ultimate psychological paradox is fascinating. As the text puts it, something can reduce anxiety and still distort reality. You see, organisms defend orientation before they defend truth. Let me say that again because it's a real game changer. We defend orientation before truth. We cling to these familiar falsehoods because familiarity feels safe, and safety feels stable. We completely mistake stability for correctness, even when the foundations of our house are literally cracking beneath our feet.
Let's use a super relatable example here. Think about a family clinging to the label of the responsible sibling. Long after all the evidence has complicated that assignment, the map survives. Why? Because that map does heavy relational work. It distributes identity. It allocates sympathy and blame. It stabilizes expectations and organizes the emotional traffic. Because if the family admits the responsible sibling is actually just, compliant and enabling, well, the entire system has to face a chaotic reorganization. So to avoid that, the family fiercely protects the broken map.
And sometimes, attempting to force that map to change goes horribly, horribly wrong. The sources provide this hilarious Thanksgiving anecdote. You go home, determined to be your new, highly integrated self. Aunt Carol innocently asks why you don't have a real job yet. But instead of setting a normal, polite boundary, you yell, Aunt Carol, I am occupying the autonomous variable 1 position. The gravy is a capacitant shadow with no independent agency. And she just stares at you. Screaming jargon at Aunt Carol is a failure of boundaries, folks, not a sign of integration. You're experiencing field confusion, expecting deep conscious co-creation from a holiday dinner table.
So, if screaming at Aunt Carol isn't the answer, what is? Enter Section 3, the 4DP Reconstruction Framework. This is our master key to breaking down those old walls.
The sources define 4DP as the 4-dimensional pillars. Now, this isn't just some list of optional life hacks. It is the requisite, completely non-negotiable architecture for lasting transformation. Imagine an ancient temple supported by 4 massive pillars. It's an interlocking system, like a combination lock. Missing even a single pillar causes your entire transformation to collapse into total incoherence. You can't just pick and choose. They hold each other up.
Let's walk through each of these pillars step by step. First is target. Where are you actually aiming right now? Second is truth. What do you actually believe? And this requires radical self-honesty about where you currently are. Third is totally. Are you all in, or are you kind of hedging your bets? You have to decode the full complexity of your path. And finally, fourth is title. What story or label are you living inside? You've got to hold your identity fluidly. Together, these 4 components act as the foundational layer of our entirely new life architecture.
Let's see how this builds into practical reality. We can easily contrast the old unconscious state with the new conscious state using a career evolution as our example. Pre-4DP, you're reactive. Your target is unclear. Maybe it's just make more money. Your truth is inherited, like work is just supposed to be miserable. You're hedging your commitment and living inside a borrowed identity like the loyal employee. But post-4DP, you become autonomous. You've got a focused aim, an honest assessment of your skills, full totality in your commitment, and a fluid title that actually adapts as you grow.
Which brings us to our final phase today, Section 4, Linear Reality Deduction. This is all about tracing the nested holding of your life.
This visual gets right at what the text calls the nested holding of your life. Think of realities like a set of Russian nesting dolls. You hit a point of resistance, say a closed door. But that door only exists because a frame is holding it there. The frame only exists because a wall was built around it, and the wall only exists because a foundational blueprint demanded a separation of space to begin with. Linear reality deduction is the active practice of tracing your immediate emotional reaction all the way down to that inherited blueprint that made it possible in the first place.
Let's test this architecture against the real world.
The sources give us two hilarious yet painful case studies. First, the IKEA breakdown. You try to build a bookshelf, declaring yourself a master builder, but you ignore the terrible instructions and the one missing dowel, and you end up collapsing on the rug in tears. Second, the 405 traffic jam. You declare yourself perfectly zen, one with the universe, right up until a BMW cuts you off without a blinker and your enlightenment evaporates in a quarter second of pure road rage. The lesson here? If your spiritual architecture falls apart because of a missing piece of particle board or a bad driver, you don't have an architecture, you have a hobby.
So the absolutely crucial point is this. True architecture doesn't shatter upon contact with reality, it is specifically built to respond to it. This whole masterclass explainer isn't about perfectly avoiding traffic or sidestepping difficult relatives. It's about recognizing the sorting systems, the internalizations, and those broken maps that we so fiercely defend. You have the admin password now. It is time to stop just clicking the icons and actually rewrite the menu.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought. You now possess the 4DP framework. You know exactly how to trace the nested holding of your reality. The tools are literally right there in your hands. So, which of your inherited maps will you redesign today? Thank you so much for joining me for part 3. Keep aiming, keep questioning, and start building.
Okay, let's start things off with a pretty wild thought experiment. Imagine a massive meteor is hurtling toward Earth right this very second, and it's scheduled to hit in exactly 10 minutes. Can your credit score stop it? Unless your credit score is somehow, woven out of solid titanium and launched into the stratosphere? Absolutely not. What about your job title? The prestige you have at the office? No way. Literally none of these abstract concepts can physically enter the collision and alter the trajectory of a billion-ton space rock. The rock simply does not care about the Dow Jones. And honestly, that brutal, totally unavoidable physical reality is the absolute perfect hook. It shatters a collective illusion we all just sort of accept every day. The illusion that our abstract man-made categories represent the actual physical totality of reality. Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going on a cinematic kind of journey, drawn directly from a genuinely fascinating set of texts. Our goal? To completely deconstruct the hidden blueprints that are, right now, governing your life. We're really going to dig into how society compresses us into these constricted little labels, and way more importantly, how we can break free from them to architect an infinite, boundless life. If you've ever felt like you're just running on someone else's default settings, well, this explainer is going to show you exactly how to rewrite the code. So here's our game plan for today. First, we'll cover beyond human reduction. Second, cross-domain architecture. Third, the mastery equation. And finally, number 4, the infinite game. Let's go ahead and plug into the network. Starting off with Section 1, Beyond Human Reduction, Breaking the Nodes. So what is reduction? Basically, it's the compression of complex reality into a simplified, symbolic form. And, let's be fair here. The source text makes it super clear that human brains actually have to reduce complexity just to survive. Think about it. A kid touches a hot stove once, and their nervous system instantly builds a map. Do not touch glowing metal. You can't sit there and calculate the physics of every single moving car when you cross the street, right? You rely on shorthand. So the problem isn't that we map reality. The real danger kicks in when we forget that our maps are just maps. When we start mistaking the map for the territory itself, our systems become incredibly rigid. Think about the real-world consequence of mistaking that map for reality. When massive institutions look at populations, they tend to use these flattened descriptions. They use sterile words like cases, service gaps, and non-compliance. And doing that completely thins our moral urgency. It converts this vast human experience into a neat, manageable abstraction. But on the flip side, think about rich descriptions. Words like interrupted lives, accumulated humiliation, and, well, people. Rich description actively resists reduction. It keeps actual personhood present inside the analysis. Because when we use flattened language, it becomes far, far too easy to look away from suffering. Mainly because the actual human has just disappeared beneath the abstraction. The absolutely crucial point here is that the terrain always exceeds the map. No label, no medical diagnosis, no algorithmic profile, and certainly no credit score can ever fully contain a human life. We are living processes. We are constantly changing, adapting, learning, and reconstructing ourselves. When a civilization forgets this, when it lets the representation become more important than humanity itself, it inevitably drifts toward dehumanization. You've got to remember, you are always more than your categories. moving right along to Section 2, Cross-Domain Architecture, Connecting the Network. According to the text, there are basically two fundamental ways you can live your life. The first is what they call the R1/V life, responsive to external variables. In this mode, you're the kind of person who lets a confusing instruction manual for an IKEA shelf ruin your entire weekend, or you let someone cutting you off in traffic completely dictate your emotional state for the day. You are just constantly reacting. But the alternative is the AV/1 life, Autonomous Variable 1. In this state, you are the baseline. You aren't sitting around waiting for the world to magically offer the right opportunity. You are the architect. The external conditions, they're just variables you work with, not variables that define you. Now, when you actually start operating from that autonomous baseline, it's like you tap into this glowing, interconnected network of human capability. When you finally stop siloing your life into neat little separate boxes like career goes here, health goes there, relationships over there, you start to realize that every single domain runs on the exact same operating system. Your skills transfer. When you touch one part of this network skillfully, these incredible shockwaves move through the whole entire thing. So, if you really want to transform your life, you have to look at what the text calls cascade potential. Learning a really narrow technical skill like, say, an Excel macro has low cascade. It's useful, sure, but it only applies when you're literally staring at a spreadsheet. But somatic and nervous system regulation, relational intimacy, those are high transfer domains. If you learn to regulate your nervous system, that capacity cascades brightly into your career, into how you handle a sudden crisis, into how you connect with your partner. Your foundational architecture suddenly supports momentum everywhere. All right, on to Section 3, the mastery equation. The infinite sum. Okay, don't let the calculus intimidate you here. The text actually provides a mathematical formula for mastery, and it elegantly models how transformation isn't just a simple addition problem, it's an infinite compounding process. That limit as n approaches infinity part, that just tells us there is absolutely no ceiling. The sum and product symbols basically represent how every single transformation cycle you go through mathematically amplifies the very next one. Let's go ahead and translate that heavy math into something we can actually feel, the linguistic equation. Mastery is every transformation you complete, multiplied by the exponential power of everything you have already become. So think about it like this. If you spent year 1 mastering physical discipline, when you decide to master a brand new business skill in year 2, you aren't starting from scratch. Not at all. You apply the exact same discipline blueprint. Cycle 2 completes 40% faster because you're operating with the amplified velocity of Cycle 1. It's a real game changer. And this compounding growth builds over a lifetime in 3 distinct phases. Years 1 through 3 are multi-domain competence. You're just running a few transformation cycles in different areas, gaining some solid confidence. Then, years 3 through 7, that's cross-domain integration. This is the sweet spot where the domains start talking to each other. That identity reinforcement that worked so well for you in the gym, it suddenly starts working in your professional life. Finally, years 8 and beyond, embodiment and metasystems. At this point, you don't just build systems anymore, you build systems that generate other systems. The separate skills completely merge into a unified, continuous practice. And that brings us to Section 4, the infinite game beyond boundaries. You know, most people out there are playing a finite game. They want to hit a specific career target, make a certain amount of money, and just win. The rules are totally fixed, and it inevitably ends in either victory or defeat. But mastery is an infinite game. The goal isn't to win, the goal is to just keep playing. The rules evolve, growth itself is the entire point. If you hit a target and just coast, you're mistaking arriving at one level for arriving at the level. But the truth is, there is no final level. There is literally only infinite depth. And this brings us to a truly beautiful concept from the text called the paradox of completion. You might actually reach a plateau where your personal architecture of mastery stands completely sturdy. Your fragmentation is repaired, you feel whole. But the paradox is that mastery is actually completely unfinished until it is given away. The skills that liberate you personally hold their absolute greatest power when they cascade out to liberate others. Your personal breakthrough is just the beginning of your responsibility to the collective. Which brings us to a profound paradigm shift. You are not achieving mastery. You are becoming mastery itself. That shifts the entire narrative, doesn't it? Mastery isn't a shiny trophy you put on a shelf. It's definitely not a fixed state you achieve and then forget about. It is a continuous way of being, where the practice completely transforms the practitioner. You are the terrain that exceeds the map. So, we've looked at how to break free from reductive, flattened categories. We've explored how to connect your life through cross-domain architecture, the incredible compounding math of your own personal growth, and the boundless, ongoing nature of the infinite game. The network is glowing with living intelligence. It's not just a system you use, it is who you are actively becoming. So I want to leave you staring into this boundless network with the final provocative question posed by the text. The practice calls. The journey continues. How deep are you willing to go?